Hello everybody and welcome to my spoiler review of Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, which is now in theaters everywhere. As I mentioned, this does go into full spoilers for the movie. If you want to see my non-spoiler review of the film, you can click on the little card up in the corner where I'm whispering in a hotel room because I was on the road. I can be much more full volume, and that's good because I have a lot to talk about, a lot of things I liked about the movie, a lot of things that I didn't like about the movie, and a lot of things in between. So let's get into it, and let's talk first about my general thoughts because, when I did the first review, I had literally just seen the movie a few hours before. I've had time to marinate on it. I went to see it a second time so that I could kind of follow up on some of my feelings and take some notes for this review. And generally, I found that my feelings haven't really changed that much from the first time I saw the movie a couple weeks ago. It's not the triumphant farewell for the character of Indiana Jones that I wish that it could have been, although I think that it's easily better than Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which I still do not like very much at all. On any given day, given the 5 existing Indiana Jones films now, I would say that I would choose Raiders of the Lost Ark or Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade first and foremost, pretty much any time. Depending on my mood, I would pick either Temple of Doom or this one if I were going to go to a second tier, and then I would almost never choose to watch Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. That's basically how these movies tier out for me. Now, something I wanted to go into a little more detail about, because I couldn't really in my non-spoiler review, was regarding leaks. Because I said in my earlier review that some of the crazy, outrageous leaks that have been out there about the movie were not true. And so that if you were basing your decision on whether or not to see the movie based on those leaks, then you shouldn't, because that didn't turn out to be accurate information. And I got a lot of pushback saying like, well, wait a minute. I read these leaks, and from what I hear, they're all true. And it's basically apparently 2 sets of leaks. The ones that were accurate were the ones that came out after the movie premiered in Cannes several weeks ago, which turned out to be kind of a tactical mistake by Disney because the reviews weren't very strong coming out of the Cannes Film Festival. Those weren't so much leaks as they were just spoilers from the movie because it had already been shown publicly. The ones that I was talking about were the ones that I had even seen. And listen, I'm not a guy that goes out in search of leaks, but they were so prevalent on the internet that I even found them. They were talking about this plot point where it was a time travel movie and Phoebe Waller-Bridge was going to go back in time to like the era of the original Indiana Jones movies, and they were going to kill the young version of Indiana Jones or something like that, and he was basically going to fade away from history. And so then the movie was going to end with Phoebe Waller-Bridge literally replacing Harrison Ford as we see her doing all of the different adventures that Indy did in the previous film trilogy, and people were just like, their hair was on fire over this thing. And really, I think a lot of the bad buzz on the internet stemmed from these leaks. Now, I think, in my personal opinion, that these leaks were never true. James Mangold has said many times that there was never a version where they were going to replace Indiana Jones or erase him from history. I think that these were fake leaks that were put out there to generate outrage and to get people to hate this movie. And of course, the people that were telling you what these leaks were, now that they turn out not to be true, are saying like, well, that's because they saw the outrage and they changed everything. They rewrote the entire movie. They reshot the entire ending. It's because they saw that we wouldn't stand for this kind of thing, which of course is what they're going to say, because they're not going to say like, no, we were wrong or we made this up or whatever. But when I talk about the leaks that aren't accurate, those are the ones that I'm talking about, the ones that were just outrageously untrue and remain untrue. Now, whether you choose to believe that they changed the movie because of those leaks and that they actually were accurate, that's your decision. I don't personally think that's the case, but whatever. That's what I was talking about when I discussed leaks. So let's go into some specific things about the movie. And one thing that I actually had to look up and that was kind of confusing to a lot of people was the Paramount logo that comes up at the top of the movie. Of course, Paramount was the studio that distributed the original Indiana Jones films, and often the Paramount Mountain logo would turn into something that would take us into the opening of that sequence. But of course, Lucasfilm is now owned by Disney, and I was surprised to see that Paramount logo there along with the Disney and Lucasfilm logos. And I had to go back into the research machine and find that back in 2013, there was actually a deal that was struck so that Disney would be able to handle distribution. And part of that deal was that Paramount would continue to be in association with, partner with the films, and then would have some kind of financial involvement, whether that's box office, whether that's any profits that the movie might make, although that looks like that might be a bit of an uphill climb at this point. But Paramount was not directly involved with the production of the film. The reason you see that logo there is that was a byproduct of the deal they made with Disney so that Disney could fully take over the Indiana Jones franchise. Now, even though it's a new studio, we do start off in the old Indiana Jones times, and we're in World War II, and we have that de-aging stuff. I talked about it a little bit in my other review. I'm still not there with the technology. I don't think that it's quite there yet. Like, when the person is still, when Harrison Ford was still, like, you could take a freeze frame and it would look pretty good. Or maybe if the scene was kind of darkly lit. But there were other times, anytime basically that Indiana Jones had to be in motion, or he was speaking and you could see the, muscles in his face move, it just looked fake. It was like I was watching a video game cutscene. And it also didn't really help that Harrison Ford's voice was noticeably older in some of the opening lines. Sometimes he sounded like young Indy. Sometimes he sounded like current day Harrison Ford, which I get, the guy's 80 years old. He can't completely radically change his voice. And some people have said like, well, Dan, it's like any other visual effect. You have to understand that what you're not seeing is real and kind of have that suspension of disbelief. And, I can do that when I'm looking at a Hulk or an alien spaceship or the Titanic from 1912, something that I know does not physically exist in reality. But my brain, my mind understands, I know what a human face looks like and what a human face should look like and how it should move. And I just can't turn that part of my brain off to say like, well, I'm going to accept this as a real human face. It just looks fake. And there's part of me that says, I really hope, because so many studios intend to keep using this technology, I hope they get better at it. But part of me is also saying like, I kind of hope they don't, because it's a little creepy. It's probably the best that I've seen, especially on Harrison Ford so far, but I still just didn't quite buy it, and it did take me out of this opening sequence just a bit. This opening sequence, though, did feel like the climax of an Indiana Jones film, an entire movie that we never really got to see, where he teams up with Toby Jones's character, and it kind of continues this through line with Hitler of pursuing these ancient artifacts. In this case, it was this lance that supposedly spilled the blood of Jesus, and also in keeping with what we know of Hitler in this Indiana Jones universe, he's pursuing the wrong artifact. It's a fake. It doesn't even really have any power anyway. And I think what this does is, of course, it gives us a reason to have Indiana Jones and Toby Jones there and being a part of this action, because they're trying to save history, and preserving history is a theme that we come back to later in the film. But I think it also establishes this resentment on the part of Voller in knowing that Hitler is making a mistake. And on the train, he's saying like, I know the thing we should be going after, and it's not this thing, and nobody listens to them. And you kind of lay those seeds about what his real plan is going to be, which of course is not to help Hitler, but to kill and replace Hitler, because he thinks that he can do it better. And so that's something the first time you're watching that you don't really notice, but when you know where it's going, you're like, oh, okay, I see what this really served, what the purpose of this opening was. So then we flash forward to 1969, and can I just say, I wish, like, I would be lucky to be half as in shape at age 80 as Harrison Ford is. I mean, listen, I'm not half as in shape at age 40 right now as Harrison Ford is at age 80. But I mean, the guy, the commitment to just keeping it together and keeping himself in top form for this role and for every other role, it is really admirable. A lot of people take exception with the idea of Indy being where he is in his life at the beginning of this movie. And I'm kind of split on it, because I've said I don't like the fact that we always take our heroes now, it seems, in these legacy sequels, whatever you want to call them, and make them miserable. I think there is something to the idea that as you get older, and they even addressed it a little bit in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and even really kind of going back to Last Crusade, but as you get older, things get taken away from you in life, and things do get a little bit more melancholy. And I don't think there's anything wrong with acknowledging that. But the thing that I really don't like is that they essentially replicated the story that they came up with for Han Solo with this Indiana Jones movie, which is another Harrison Ford character. You have Indiana Jones, who is sad, very sad at the loss of his son, which means that he's alienated his wife, Marion, who he has pushed away. And that's literally exactly where we find Han Solo and Leia at the beginning of The Force Awakens. And I'm kind of surprised that it got through the script in that form, because it is so, I'll call it derivative of what they already did with another Harrison Ford character. It's not so much for me where they bring him into the story or where we get brought into the story. It's that it is so similar. Having said that, I think that Harrison Ford was really good in this movie, and that scene where he's on the boat talking to Helena and she asks what he would do if he would time travel, and he talks about going back in time and talking Mutt out of enlisting. That's a really good piece of writing, and it was a really good piece of acting from Harrison Ford, and I think this goes to show that you can take a plot point that's maybe not the best and really salvage a lot out of it with some pretty good writing and some really, really good acting. Mutt, listen, he was a very divisive character when it comes to Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. It was a bit of a Poochie situation. He died on the way to his home planet. But at least it wasn't just a throwaway. It did have some impact, as it should. I don't think that it was trivialized necessarily. For people that didn't mind the character or were hoping to see more of Mutt Williams, well, sorry about that. But yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag for me on that part of the film. When it comes to the aging part, the character that I actually think they handled it really well with was Sallah. Because we have John Rhys Davies, who, by the way, is just delightful in this movie. And I'm glad that they could come up with a way, at least where it makes sense, to bring Sallah back. It doesn't feel like too much of a stretch. But he's a guy, he's now older, as is Indiana Jones. He's in a different place in his life, as is Indiana Jones. But Sallah is happy with where he is. He says that Indy helped him get and bring his family over to the United States. But he has that scene where he says, let me go with you because, I miss the days of waking up and, being out there in the air, not knowing what the day's going to bring, and these days of adventure. Like, I wish that they had maybe been able to graft a little bit more of that onto Indiana Jones, because to me that was a way to acknowledge that your characters are aging, but at the same time give them a little bit of a hopefulness and a little bit more of a current day satisfaction. I don't necessarily think you have to have Indy be in a place where he's satisfied at the beginning of the film, but I think that the character of Sallah was a great balance between those two, and I liked how he was used in the movie. One thing that bothered me story-wise is that there was that whole subplot about Indy being framed for murder, which to me was kind of why? Because he was there, and then they just dropped it. I mean, the assumption I think would be that somewhere off screen that they kind of settled it somehow and he was cleared of the charges, or maybe somebody made a statement to the cops or something. But to me, it was just kind of business. It was just a little bit of business to throw in there to try to up the stakes. And I think that the stakes in the movie were already pretty high. I mean, literally the stakes of the movie are you have to stop better Hitler from going back in time and making the world Nazis. That's pretty high stakes. I don't think you need to add to that the fact that Indy might be framed for murder and then just kind of drop that subplot entirely. So that's something that was a loose end. And we'll talk about the use of time in this movie. That was some time that was spent on a piece of the plot that it just really had no consequence. You could cut that from the movie entirely and it wouldn't really matter. And kind of similarly, it also bothered me, and this is just because I love that movie so much, that in the second flashback that they did, where Indy is talking to Toby Jones's character about destroying the dial, and Helena Shaw is a young girl, they have the flashback kind of half de-aged Indy, and he's wearing almost the exact same outfit as Dr. Richard Kimball is at the end of The Fugitive. And just because they kind of had aged Harrison Ford back to that era in his life, and you also had the kind of framed for a murder on the run from the authorities, that took me out of it, because I'm like, oh wow, is this whole thing just a Harrison Ford tribute? Are there going to be Mosquito Coast and Witness Easter eggs later on in this movie? Again, that's just a weird thing that's going to stick in my head, and that I'm sure that wasn't intentional, but it was something that again was a distraction for me. Again, basically because you had this weird orphan storyline about Indy being framed. So this wasn't an all-time classic Indy movie for me, certainly not on the level of the first movie and the third one, but it did have some classic Indy moments. And the two that were some of my favorites were the ones where he's directly dealing with Voller. There was one where when they're at the hotel in Tangier, Voller says, "You should have stayed in New York," and Indy says, "You should have stayed out of Poland." And then later on in the film, when they're getting onto the plane, Voller has the line about, "Oh, buckle up, there might be some turbulence." And he says, "You're German, you shouldn't try to be funny." Honestly, the absolute hatred and impatience that Indiana Jones has for Nazis is one of my favorite through lines throughout all of these films. Because obviously, yes, they're Nazis. We hate them. They're the bad guys. There's no other side. Is it? You just hate them. But the specific hate that Indiana Jones has for Nazis is so great. And I like that they were able to find a way to pull that into this movie.
Nazis. I hate these guys.
And let's talk about Voller, who was the big bad Nazi villain in this movie. I think that Mads Mikkelsen was a great choice for this role, and it really starts even in that first scene in 1969. I mean, he's there, in the prologue, but you really get to the heart of that character when the hotel porter, who is black, brings his meal to him, and he's just like messing with the guy and talking about like, where are your people from? Oh, where are they from originally? And talking about, oh, did you serve? Oh, are you enjoying your victory? And sort of twisting that knife about the racism that this black man most definitely faced after coming home and fighting for his country. And I think that it sets up a couple things with Voller. One of them is just his sadistic nature, and then this just Aryan contempt that he still has, and it feeds into him trying to go back and making the Nazis win. But I think that was such a well-written scene, and I also want to shout out Alton Fitzgerald White, who was the other actor. He played the porter in that scene. Again, that's proof that there really are no small roles, because his side of that conversation also just sold it, and the restraint and just that internal monologue you could see him having with himself. I just thought that was an example of how you can establish who your villain is with a very short scene, but if it's well written and well acted, you don't need to do 5 less well written scenes later on down the road. I also love that Voller's plan wasn't to help Hitler, it was to kill Hitler and replace him. And again, going back to the script, and I have my issues with the script, but I think that in some places it's really well written. That same first scene in the hotel room when he says, "You didn't win the war, Hitler lost it," that again feeds right into his plan. He's not going to go back and just see Hitler make the same mistakes. He's going to go back with his master plan, and it's actually kind of chilling to think about, well, what if this dial had worked and he had been able to go back? Because obviously I think that he's a smart enough character that he could have done it. Now, we're never under the pretense that he's going to do it, but you have to make that character threatening. And the combination of having someone like Mads Mikkelsen in that role and the writing that's done was great. I actually wish that there had been more Voller. I think you could have used 2 or 3 more scenes to really turn him into an all-timer villain, but great casting there goes a long way. So let's talk about Helena Shaw, who's played by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, and is also apparently the focus of so much of the anger about this movie. Has been for months, I think largely because of those leaks that came out that said that she was going to literally erase Indiana Jones from history, which didn't end up happening. But now that the movie has come out, and since the accurate plot details also came out on the internet, then there has been a lot of criticism about her as an actress, but also about Helena Shaw as a character. And a lot of the criticism of her character, and I've seen it in many places around the internet, usually boils down to some version of Helena Shaw is a perfect character who constantly belittles and insults Indiana Jones, shoves him out of the way, knows everything, and turns our hero into a sniveling sidekick, which I not only disagree with just on a personal level, but which I think the movie actually disproves if you're really reading it accurately. Let's take the criticism that Helena Shaw is a character who knows everything. First of all, she is a very smart character. She's a character who went to Oxford, has a degree in archaeology, is working on a doctorate. So in that sense, in an academic sense, yes, she is very smart. She is also an expert on one thing particularly, which is Archimedes' dial. But it's largely because she is working off of her father's research. She memorized his journals. So all of this knowledge that she has is not necessarily because she's some perfect character who's able to just pull things out of the ether. It's because she's piggybacking off what her father did, and not necessarily for the best purposes. She's actually kind of a mirror to Indy in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and his father's search for the Holy Grail. And I actually liked that scene where Indy and Helena are talking, and he says, well, why are you pursuing this thing that drove your father crazy? And she says, well, wouldn't you? That does set up what initially seems to be kind of this partnership of equals, but then we learn that she's a much more complicated character. In fact, she's not a perfect character. She's a very flawed character, because unlike her father and Indy, who have a respect and a reverence for history and for all these different artifacts, at the beginning of the film, she's in it for the money. She's much closer to Belloc. You could say that she's a modern day version of Belloc. Fortune and glory. She's going to sell that thing to whoever. She doesn't really care. She just wants her name in the magazines. She wants to collect all of the money that's coming to her. She's as little like Indiana Jones in that sense as you could imagine. She lacks perspective. And she lacks understanding, which I think is what Indiana Jones gives her. That moment when they are escaping from the boat and she's kind of jumping up and down and she's just giddy because they just had this thing with the Nazis. And Indy says, my friend just died. And you see that all of this stuff that is to her just fun and games, he comes from a real world. He's lived this life. He understands the consequences of what's going on. And it's this sharing of knowledge that I think is what makes their partnership a lot more of a two-way street than people seem to want to make it out to be. It's not just her shoving him aside. There is a lot that Indiana Jones knows that she needs to learn too. And then just on a plot level, she doesn't have the answer to everything because it's Indy who figures out how to melt the wax away and uncover the Graphicos. When they get to the Tomb of Archimedes, he solves every single puzzle in the Ear of Dionysius. He's the one that's able to figure out the cave puzzle.
Get in the pool!
Why? Help me open the door!
Well, they didn't get out the doors. Get in the pool!
He's the one that's able to figure out to go up to where the crescent is. That's all Indiana Jones. And again, that's all his experience because he's done all of this stuff in the tombs. And if it was just up to her, she has no practical experience. She would never have been able to do that. She would have been trapped in that methane room. It's Indy who knows how to do all of that. They're definitely partners, and she does bring some skill to the table, but I don't think that you have a compelling character for her if you don't have Indiana Jones there with her, not like alongside her, but I mean literally with her, driving the plot and showing to her that she's not this sort of unashamed, unabashed capitalist that she claims to be, that there is a love for her father's work that she needs to understand that's already inside of her, and then just this reverence and respect for history and understanding the consequences of being this person who will sell out to anybody. Honestly, I think many of the issues that people have with Helena and Indiana Jones and their relationship with each other boils down to the third act of the film and her knocking Indy out. Again, I've seen the criticism that this is showing that she's a superior character because she knocks Indy out and she takes his choice away and, that weakens his character. But to me, that is basically the completion of both of their character arcs. I think that it could have been executed better. And I think that that's where a lot of that criticism is coming from. But again, I think if you look at, as flawed as it may be, the arcs that you already have in this movie, then that decision actually makes sense. The first time I saw it, I actually was thinking oh, wow, this makes sense for Indiana Jones. He's going to become a part of history, this thing that he's loved all of his life. This is going to be where his story ends. And, I thought about it for a while, and then even seeing it the second time, it just didn't really sit right with me the more that I thought about it, because that would basically mean that the whole idea of Indiana Jones being completely useless in the modern world was true. And the end of his character arc would be that he would die in the past alone amongst strangers. Nobody who knew him would ever see him again. He would never see anyone who loved him again. All the alienation that he had with Marion, with everybody else, that would be permanent. Sala would lose a friend, and he would just become a dusty relic to be uncovered in some tomb somewhere, and nobody would even know who he was. That moment when he lays eyes on history unfolding, I thought that was a beautifully acted moment from Harrison Ford, because, think about that. If you're Indiana Jones, that's the realization of your life's dream. You actually get to see these things that you were just teaching these disinterested college students just a few days earlier. But I also think that he's blinded by that history. And this is something that has happened to Indiana Jones almost every time that we've seen him. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, he doesn't blow up the Ark because he can't bring himself to destroy a piece of history.
We are simply passing through history. This is history.
In Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, he almost falls victim to the Holy Grail because he can't let it go. His father has to bring him back from the brink.
Indiana, let it go.
And here, where he's literally watching history in action, I think that he lets himself be blinded by it once again. And it is a recurrent character thing with him. He lacks perspective in that moment, and that's what I think draws his arc and Helena's arc together. The perspective that he lacks in that moment is what he has given Helena throughout the entire rest of the film, which is why she is the one that's able to make that decision, because he can only see the past. And that is a character flaw that Indiana Jones has had many times before. I actually like the journey that Helena takes in this movie because she learns that Indy is not the grave robber as she calls him. And I can't think of any bigger insult to Indiana Jones than by calling him a grave robber. And I worry that some people are going to think that because she calls him a grave robber at some point in this movie, that the movie is calling him a grave robber, which that's not what he is. And he never has been. And he's spoken out against that sort of thing.
This is the second time I've had to reclaim my property from you.
That belongs in a museum.
So do you.
But she doesn't know him. She doesn't know his character, and that's what she learns throughout the course of the film. And I think that that's the respect that she affords him, because she doesn't want that to be the end for him, and she wants this hopeful future for him. So these are all pretty deep themes, and they definitely could have been executed better. I do feel that the conclusion of the film was very rushed. It was like a compressed version of what could have been, I think, a very sort of elegiac, poetic closing, and this sort of speech about that Indy could have talked about history, and I think that they played him a little too kind of loopy, and he was losing blood, he'd been shot and stuff. But I wish that they could have made it a little bit less out of desperation and a little bit more out of, they always say show don't tell, but I do think that there could have been more interaction between these two to understand where they're both coming from. We didn't get that, and I think that that's left the movie open to a lot of criticism. There is also, by the way, I did a little bit of research on my own, a practical historical reason why Indy could not have stayed in the past, which is that the siege of Syracuse, in that moment, the Romans were repelled, they were turned away, but ultimately the Romans won. They stormed Syracuse, and Archimedes was killed by a Roman soldier not long after the events that are portrayed in this movie. So you would have to think that if Indy did survive, if he didn't die immediately from his wound, and if he was living back there in that time, then he either, perhaps out of instinct or whatever, would have saved Archimedes' life, or at the very least, perhaps would have told him what was going to happen, and perhaps Archimedes doesn't die, which could have, in effect, had huge ramifications on history. And that's, again, what Indiana Jones's mission is about. It belongs in a museum. Preserving history is Indiana Jones' purpose in life. And again, in that moment, he didn't see that. He loses that perspective. He's taught Helena the value of that perspective, and that's why she makes that decision for him. Honestly, I think the only thing that would have made sense if you want to keep Indy in the past would have been some sort of a self-sacrifice that would have stopped Voller from somehow changing history, but that's not the way that the story was set up. And so I don't mind the choices that were made. So generally, I didn't really mind Helena as a character. I think that Phoebe Waller-Bridge and Harrison Ford had a good on-screen rapport. I like that moment in the Tangier Hotel where she calls him Jonesy, and Harrison Ford just goes, Jonesy, and you see like flashes of Ray Winstone from the last movie going through his head. The development of that relationship between the two of them I thought was really strong. I certainly have had less affinity for companions like Willie Scott from Temple of Doom, or even Mutt from Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Didn't really have that same effect on me. I'm not going to hold the actors responsible for the shortcomings at the script phase. And, she's a character that apparently bothered a lot of people. She didn't really bother me, and I think as flawed as the execution was, the story arc between the two of them also made a lot of sense. There's a lot more to get into, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsor for this episode, Factor. July 4th barbecues are coming up, so that's one meal that's easy to plan. But what about all the others, especially during the time of year where you want to spend more time outside and less time prepping food? Well, that's where Factor comes in. America's #1 ready-to-eat meal kit can help you fuel up fast with ready-to-eat meals delivered straight to your door. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are ready in just 2 minutes, so all you have to do is heat and enjoy, then get back outside to soak up that summer sun. Whether you're looking for calorie-conscious options or an extra boost of energy, Factor offers delicious flavor-packed options on the menu each week to fit a variety of lifestyles, from keto to calorie smart, vegan plus veggie, and protein plus. With 34 plus chef-prepared, dietitian-approved weekly options, there's always something new to try. Plus, you can round out your meal assortment and replenish your snack supply with an assortment of 45 plus add-ons, including breakfast items and shakes. And it's great for a budget because not only is Factor cheaper than takeout, but meals are ready faster than restaurant delivery in just 2 minutes. Head to factormeals.com/Murrell50 and use code Murrell50 to get 50% off your first box. That's code Murrell, Murrell 50 at factormeals.com/Murrell50 to get 50% off your first box. So let's talk about the third act, the finale of the film, and the time-traveling trip back to the Siege of Syracuse back in 214 BC. It's the kind of thing that you're either going to go with or you're not going to go with. And I understand it. For example, some people go with the whole interdimensional beings thing in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. I don't go with it. It's not just the fact that they're, quasi aliens. It's the execution of it. I just think the execution of it is way too goofy, and I'm sure a lot of people think that about the finale of this film. That's fine. People feel differently about different things. I think it makes sense with the franchise in general, because in every single Indiana Jones movie, whatever artifact the bad guy is trying to misuse in order to gain power, it in some way turns against that bad guy. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, the Ark, of course, melts the faces off a bunch of Nazis and blows their heads up. In Temple of Doom, the Shankara stones are what really doom Mola Ram to death. The Wrong Grail in Last Crusade turns Walter Donovan into dust. The knowledge from Kingdom of the Crystal Skull makes Irena Spalko's head blow up. So I think that having Voller's plan backfire definitely makes sense. And it's really about, do you buy whatever the twist is? And I liked this idea that Archimedes was able to use math as a beacon, that he's looking at this situation that's hopeless, where everything's going to be overrun by these Romans. And he says, well, I'm going to try inventing this device that's basically a signal, a call for help. And hopefully it will bring somebody here that can help us, that can get us out of this situation. And it does, at least that day. It's able to help them. And it's set up with that whole card trick on the boat where Helena's doing the, pick a card and it's the 7 of spades every time. And she's saying, well, it's a false choice. I make you think that you can, pick whatever card you want, but in reality, you're picking the card that I want you to pick. I like that. I like that twist. I think it has that combination of the kind of mystical, but also the, science mathy side that I like with the Indiana Jones movies. And I think that just in general, the action, I liked seeing a World War II era plane going on strafing runs and battling these Roman galleys as they're shooting arrows that are taking out people and going through soldiers and taking out the engines of the plane. I just thought that was a really cool, fun, inventive, history nerdy action sequence. But I also can see, as I'm describing it, people say well, that's too much. That's too unbelievable. That's too far. I get it. It's all down to personal preference. I thought that it was a really cool, fun way to twist what you thought was going to happen, which is they're going to go back to Nazi Germany and Indiana Jones is going to punch a bunch of Nazis in the face, blah, 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 blah. I thought this was a fun, different way to do that finale. Also, I think the concept of giving Indiana Jones, the character, a chance to see this kind of history. He's seen World War II many times. He lived it. Taking him back to World War II wouldn't really mean anything. Giving him the chance to see something with his own eyes that he never thought he would be able to see. I also think that was just such a great gift fictionally to that character, that even though he doesn't end up there in the past, to many people's consternation, he got to see it. He got to interact with Archimedes. He got this taste of what he's devoted his life to in a way that nobody else is going to get. It'd be like if I got to magically get transported back to see Steven Spielberg shooting Jaws. That would be something that was so special specifically to me because of the meaning of that in my life. And it was great to see Indy get that gift. So those are some things that did work for me. Let's talk about a few things that didn't work for me. I mentioned that Helena as Indy's companion did work for me. Teddy is a character that almost entirely did not work. And, I feel bad for the young actor who played Teddy. I don't think that the performance is very strong, but also just in general, the character really only seemed to exist in the movie because they're wow, we need a second plane to follow them into the time thing to get them back. So we need a pilot. Well, who's going to fly the plane? You could have had Helena fly the plane, honestly. And the idea of well, how can he fly a plane? Oh, well, there were some pilots in the hotel that taught him how to do the gears on a paper reconstruction. It was too much for me. That is too much. That's a bit too much of a stretch. And I think that the producers and writers, James Mangold, whoever else, actually knew that was going to be a little much, because they literally had a second pilot sleeping in the back so that they could be well, he just has to get the plane up in the air and then we can have this other pilot land the plane and get them out of there. I think that was a sign on their side that they knew that this was kind of a logical stretch, and they tried to skirt that as much as they could. But yeah, I wish at the script phase they could have figured out a way around Teddy, because nothing about that character really worked for me. I also think the movie looked a little, and this is the traditionalist in me, a little too digital. And part of it is that Harrison Ford is 80 years old. And he just physically can't do all the things that he used to be able to do. I think that there are some definite improvements from what we saw from Crystal Skull, but I also think that one of the things that we've lost with age is the ability to, just have Harrison Ford get, dragged behind a car or hang off the edge of a tank, and you just put the camera right in his face, and it's really happening. We can't do that for any number of reasons right now, and, I get it to a certain point, but it also does mean that the movies look differently and they feel a little bit more low stakes, and they don't feel quite as classically, Saturday morning cliffhanger serial as the other movies did. And I think that you lose a little bit in that process. I also think the movie was too long. I think it could have been 20 to 25 minutes shorter easily. The prologue, while it was cool, felt stretched out. I think you can cut the whole Indy being framed for murder segment, as I've talked about. The tuk-tuk chase in Tangier was great. It was a classic Indy sequence. I think that could have been trimmed down. The eel sequence, which was really there for a great callback to Indy being afraid of snakes, you could, I think, cut that or cut it down by a lot. It really just felt padded. And when you look at the fact that a lot of that was action sequences, that padding adds up to a lot of money. This was a very expensive movie. I think it's probably going to lose a lot of that money. And when you look at movie budgets in general, I think one of the reasons they're so big is that every big movie now feels the need to be 2.5 to 3 hours long. Some of them need to be, but most of them don't need to be. And it's not just audience patience that's wearing thin. Every single minute that you see on screen has a certain dollar amount attached to it. And if you cut 30 minutes from this movie, you probably cut $30 to $50 million in budget out as well. At a minimum, if you want to keep the movie the same length, I think you could have cut some of that action time and given more time to the arc and the story between Helena and Indy. A couple more scenes with them. A couple more scenes with Voller to really kind of, bolster himself as a villain. What was Antonio Banderas doing there? You give us another scene with him if you want to throw him in the movie. He had the Puss in Boots voice going on. He seemed like a delightful guy. Not everything has to be at a 10 all the time. If you give us some classic characters and some great writing between those characters, then I think that that's going to enhance the audience experience just as much as an extra action sequence. So, at a minimum, use your time differently. And in general, I feel like to have made this movie, you had to show me the compelling reason of why. I don't understand necessarily why this movie had to be made in order to say goodbye to Indy. If this movie was made in 1999, if this was Indiana Jones 5, made in 99, and Harrison Ford had 2 or 3 more Indy movies in it, then I'd say that it was kind of like a James Bond movie, like a solid but unspectacular entry in the series. But if you add in the 15-year gap since Crystal Skull, you add in the fact that this is the definitive goodbye to Indiana Jones, it does seem to fall a little short. It's a good movie, but it seems, for what the intention is, that it should have been a great movie. I'm not an all or nothing guy, though, so just because a movie isn't great doesn't mean that it's terrible. But man, it would have been nice to just have one more movie in this franchise at the level of a Raiders of the Lost Ark or a Last Crusade. This was a nice way to say goodbye to Indiana Jones. It was a worthy addendum to the story. It was fun to see the Raiders gang. You had a sweet callback to that scene with Indy and Marion in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And, I think you left the character in a nice place. You're like, oh, okay, well, his last handful of years are going to be pleasant, and he's been able to get past this trauma in his life. But I think that the real ending for Indiana Jones still is, and always will be, Harrison Ford and the gang riding off into the sunset 34 years ago. That's the ending of this franchise. And everything else, the good, the bad, and the ugly, that's just extra stuff. And maybe that's really where I fall with this. I think The Dial of Destiny is a good movie, but ultimately it's just extra Indiana Jones when I wanted it to be essential. So those are my long spoiler thoughts on Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. What did you think? Was it the Indiana Jones adventure you'd hoped for? Did you hold it up to the high standards that I did? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching the channel. Stay tuned, because in the next couple of days, I'm going to be putting up a video about my favorite movies of the year so far. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny will not be among those movies, but there are some that I'm excited to talk about. So stay tuned for that, as well as more box office movie news, reviews, and more. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.